So it's time for our next festival edition playlist video. Passover has shown up yet again. And the thing I started last year, I said we'd probably take a few years. And what I would do is, for these videos, I would cycle through the different endings that I have to our family's Passover seder meal, which I sometimes get to share with others too. But over the years, when you do Passover year after year after year, one of the things that I've enjoyed doing with at least our family's Passover seder and with my students is I kind of have different endings to the Passover seder meal, different reflections. The seder meal is always kind of the Haggadah is always kind of the same. The Haggadah or the Haggadah is what you order of service that you use to walk you through the meal. It's the teaching, it's the interactive. Everybody has a part to read and questions to ask and a part to play, and provides the structure to the meal. And the meal's kind of always the same, but then you get to the end and you're into there's these 4 cups during the Passover that we talked about last year. And you get to the end, and cup 3, cup 4, they're after the dinner portion of the meal. And cup 3 and cup 4, it's more like conversational. There's less content and substance. And so that's where I kind of put the ending. We get to the 4th cup, and then the meal has kind of a choose your own adventure story approach for me and our family. And so last year we talked about the 5th cup, Elijah's cup, the cup of Elijah, and the 5th cup ending that I have to a Seder meal. I have an ending that explores who we are missionally as God's people, the Jewish people, the covenant children of God, but also I would extend that to followers of Jesus, just as a lesson that we can learn of who God is and what God's doing in the world and how he's called us to interact with it. And so that's the ending I'm going to go over today. You get to the 4th cup towards the end of the Seder meal. And one of the ways that, and I think I've learned most of this from Rabbi David Fohrman, just to give proper credit out there. He did a series a long, long time ago on YouTube. It's not there anymore. Eventually it became a book, one of his best books that he ever wrote, called The Exodus You Almost Passed Over, which is a very clever title, I might add. The Exodus You Almost Passed Over is a great book. He talks about a lot of this stuff in different ways. And I picked up most of this teaching from him. But he pointed out once how the Exodus story, the Passover story, is in a lot of ways this idea of firstbornness is awkwardly present. What does the idea of all the firstborn talk have to do with the Exodus or the Passover story? Like, you have the Exodus, you have the plagues, you have the story that we're familiar with, the Prince of Egypt thing. Then you get to the end, like the culmination of the whole thing, and it's, if you put blood on the doorpost of your house, your firstborn will be saved. If you don't, you're going to lose your firstborn. The Egyptians lose their firstborn. Pharaoh, and the condemnation he lives under, is that he loses his firstborn. You get to the end of the Passover story, Exodus 13, there's an entire chapter about what you do with firstborn. Like, why is the Exodus Passover story about the firstborn? It's a great question. And Rabbi Fohrman noted that when you go through the Passover story, you get to the end, and there's like this, it's almost like this cliffhanger ending, right? You get plague 1 through 9. You get to the 10th plague. It describes what's going to happen. You get to that moment where the 10th plague is going to take place. Like the music, the violins are swelling, and all of a sudden, like everything cuts silent, and Exodus stops. And it's like we pause this regularly scheduled broadcast to bring you instructions on how you're supposed to eat the Passover meal for centuries to come. And it's kind of like this whiplash, jarring, like, wait, finish the story. We'll talk about the instructions later. Like, what's going on here? And so that's part of what we do with the ending of the Seder meal when we talk about this. We go to this cliffhanger and we start to we make observations. There are some unique observations that show up. Number one, they are told in these instructions that they need to go draw out a lamb. And that's interesting language because there's a lot of words that you could pick in the Hebrew. There's a lot of words you could pick. You could use the word, you could select a lamb, pick a lamb, take a lamb would make a lot of sense. To choose the word draw out is an odd, like to draw out a lamb. Go select the lamb. Take a lamb. Why draw out a lamb? They're told in the instructions that they need to eat the Passover seder in a group of people. They need to have their staff in hand and their belt around their waist. So they're not supposed to have this meal alone. They're not supposed to have this meal kind of in a space where it's this intimate setting where you've kind of gotten relaxed for the evening. You need to be girded for action. You need to be dressed and ready to go. We're told that they have to cook a lamb in a pot that has no water. Why aren't they allowed to make it into a stew or a soup? Why can't you roast it over a fire on a spit? Why do you have to cook it in a pot with no water? And then, of course, there's this whole thing about the blood on the doors and the dipping the hyssop. That's a weird thing that you would take hyssop and dip. It doesn't just tell you to put blood on the doorpost of your home, but it tells you to dip hyssop in blood. Now, Rabbi Fohrman said if you know your Torah really, really well, if you know it very well, as many of them did and do, then you realize that these 4 elements already show up in another story. Those are 4 pretty unique elements. And it probably isn't a coincidence that those same 4 elements show up in an earlier story. It's the story of Joseph. They take Joseph and they draw him out of the cistern when they go to sell him. When Joseph is sold to slavery in Egypt, he's drawn out. There's that word. He's drawn out of a cistern. That cistern, by the way, is a cistern that has no water in it. It's a cistern with, just like the pot, with no water. The brothers, before they draw him out of the cistern, before they go to sell him, we're told that they sit down to eat just away from the cistern. They sit down in a group with their staff in hand and their belts on their waist. And then we're told that at the end of the story, they take that ornate cloak, Joseph's coat, and they dip it in blood. These same 4 elements that we talked about with the Passover story show up in the Joseph story. The Joseph story is, in a lot of ways, another story about firstborns. Joseph's story, people have noted how many parallels there are between Joseph and Jacob's story. Jacob's story is a story about firstborns. Jacob wasn't the firstborn, and yet he keeps stealing the birthright and the blessing and the role of the firstborn. Joseph is not a firstborn, and yet Joseph gets a double portion. He gets a second cloak. Daddy, Jacob, who wanted to be a firstborn, is making it clear to all the other brothers that Joseph is in fact the firstborn. All these stories are about firstborns. Kids who aren't firstborns, but they want to be. They want to be the firstborn. Rabbi Fohrman made another interesting note. He says, when you cook the lamb in Exodus 12, you're told to cook the lamb with the insides inside, is what the Hebrew says. And which a lot of us translate like with the organs inside of it, which is like, ew, gross, right? But what that can also mean in the Hebrew, how the rabbis interpreted it, is that you cook the lamb with the insides inside. What that means is you take the lamb and you fold the lamb up. They were told that they actually need to tie the lamb up with its head between its back legs. So you take the lamb, I assume that they gutted that lamb, it's ready for cooking, and they take the lamb and they put its insides inside. They tuck the head and they tie it up with its head between its rear legs, and that's how they put it in a pot with no water. That's how the tradition speaks of it. Rabbi Fohrman says what's interesting is if you tie the lamb up that way, it puts the lamb in the fetal position, We said this whole story is a story about birth, about firstborns. Rabbi Fohrman said the rabbis made the observation that when you take blood and you put it on the doorposts and the lintel, maybe even the threshold, one ancient rabbi said, when you put blood all around your door, you're leaving in a hurry, you're leaving in haste through a bloody door. That would be birth imagery. They go through the Red Sea, which the rabbis called for centuries a birth canal. The idea here is that the Passover is a story of firstbornness. Like Jacob, like Joseph, it's the story of a group of people, the children of Israel, the Israelites, who are not God's firstborn, but they're being invited to be. They're being invited, and the rabbis used to say, even though they don't use the same language today for obvious reasons, they use the language of being born again. To be born again as God's firstborn. The Exodus story was like a new birth. It's like they were being born again to start the story over as God's firstborn. What does that mean to be a firstborn? We talk about it a lot on the podcast. To be a firstborn means that you get a double portion of the inheritance. You get a double portion of blessing. But you also have to carry a double portion of responsibility. It's your job to take daddy's values and give it away to the rest of his kids. It's your job to kind of embody the legacy of your father for the rest of the household. It's your job to make sure that all of your brothers and sisters, you're the firstborn, you get to take care of all of your siblings to make sure that they have enough food, have enough shelter, have enough provision and protection. That's your job. As the Hebrew word is Bechor. The Bechor is the firstborn. And it's your job as Bechor. That's why you get the double portion of inheritance and blessing. You get a double portion of inheritance because you have a double portion of responsibility and the weight of that calling. God is inviting his people to become his Bechor, to be born again as his firstborn son. So they're going to have a special, unique relationship. They are going to be the Jewish people. They're going to have a special relationship with dad. They'll have a double portion of inheritance, you could say, a double portion of blessing, but they will also have a double portion of responsibility. And the Passover story is our reminder that that is what God calls us to. I believe that that is exactly the very conversation Jesus is having with Nicodemus, when he has a conversation with Nicodemus about being born again. Jesus says you have to be baptized by water and the Spirit. Water and Spirit are Exodus language in the rabbinical world. Because there was the Red Sea water and there was the Ruach, the wind, the Spirit, the breath of God that blew over the waters. Water and Spirit is flood language. Water and Spirit is creation language. Water and Spirit is Exodus language. So when Jesus looks at Nicodemus and says, you have to be born of water and Spirit, Nicodemus, you have to be born again. The conversation that Jesus is having with Nicodemus is, Nicodemus, if you as a teacher of Israel are not willing to start all over, if you're not willing to be born again as God's Bechor, you'll never see the kingdom of God. If you insist on staying here where you have arrived, where you think that you are the one who has all the answers. But God is inviting all of us. I think of Jesus' teaching about new wine and old wineskins. It doesn't work. Nicodemus, you're hanging on to a worldview that's not going to let you see the work of God in the world around you. He's having a very Jewish conversation with a very Jewish teacher about a very Jewish call in a Jewish story. And so I love to use our seder meal is an opportunity to remind us, all of us, that God is inviting us to be his Bechor. That the reason that the Jewish people were redeemed out of Egypt, the reason that they experienced the story of the Exodus and the story of the Passover, was so that they could go through the Red Sea, go through a new birth, and find a new creation where they in fact get a partner with God to take dad's values to the rest of his kids, to make sure that all the other siblings are taken care of, provided for, protected. It's our job as God's Bechor. May we find in the Passover an invitation to be born again. And may that reflection this year guide you in your own Passover, Seder, Holy Week, Resurrection Day thoughts. We'll talk to you in the next Festival Edition video. See you then.